Picture this. You believe that democracy is the best form of government, but you live in an authoritarian country. You are faced with a difficult choice. Do you position yourself against the government, potentially putting your and your family's lives in danger? Or do you try to immigrate to a country which already has a democratic government? The choice is one which millions of people have to make every year. Sitting in Western countries, it can often be easy to point at the people in such authoritarian countries and say, you have to fight for your right to democracy. But how many of us would really make that choice? I don't think I would take up arms in order to change an oppressive government, when I know that I can move to a government which is much more in line with my own ideology. If this sounds familiar, this is because it mirrors a classic case of brain drain. The incentive to, once highly educated, leave a poorer country to move to a wealthy one because the job opportunities are better. Brain drain has affected economies all over the world, and doesn't exclusively affect developing countries. Losing highly skilled individuals means the complexity of the industries or services that a country can offer are lower, which in turn means that the extra value added of each worker is lower. Lower value added per worker therefore incurs less international incentive to set up shop in these countries, and can severely hamper a country's ability to attract foreign direct investment or build domestic complex industry. Take Serbia as an example. As part of former Yugoslavia, Serbia has some of the best health institutes in the country, hosting 3 large universities offering medicine as a degree. The average physician in Serbia earns around 33,500 euros a year. That same doctor could earn upwards of 100,000 euros if they move to Austria. The economic incentive is clear. Granted, there are other factors which may hold people back from moving, things like taking care of family members, a sense of patriotism or nationalism, or bureaucratic hurdles to moving. But ultimately, these are difficult to quantify. And at a large scale, what we see is that educated people in poor countries tend to want to leave. So does this theory hold true for Democrats living in authoritarian countries? Firstly, many research papers indicate that as a society becomes more educated, the support for democracy increases. This is because of the incentive system at play. As an individual, if you understand how to participate in a society and what the impacts of governmental decision-making is, you are much more likely to attempt to influence said decisions. This is because you are more likely to be able to maximize your personal gain from the decision. Democracy also has a wide potential base for support, given that any adult can vote. In contrast, a dictatorship will have far less support, but the incentive structure to maintain a dictatorship is concentrated in the hands of relatively few elites who have a very strong incentive to avoid the collapse of their system, mostly because, dictatorships have a tendency towards violent government changes, rather than peaceful transitions of power. This largely explains why there are few dictatorships who, once they adopt restrictive measures, ever voluntarily walk them back. The threat posed by the discontent felt by its population is less than the threat of not having a surveillance state, for example. So given that leaders of a dictatorship know that a more educated population will be more incentivized to implement a democracy, you might be asking yourself, why educate your population past a certain point at all? Why not teach them basic skills and let them fend for themselves? While some dictatorships have chosen this path, in the long run, this is shooting yourself in the foot. Even a dictatorship has a need for technical skills and know-how. How can you extract the oil you are sitting on without the knowledge of geologists, chemists, engineers, economists, and a whole team of specialized people to actually get this stuff out of the ground? So for many dictators, ignoring education is not a viable strategy. Instead, it becomes a balancing act. How can I get both the positives from an educated population and the stability that a dictatorship offers my regime? Enter the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a complicated affair. Many contributing factors, such as poor economic performance due to corruption and inefficient central planning, a rise in nationalist independence movements of the former Soviet republics, the mishandling of the Chernobyl disaster, the failed August coup against Gorbachev, and notably the Iron Curtain, which led to a feeling of oppression, were to blame. But I'm interested in that last bit. In a situation where people cannot leave their country by choice, what does the democratization process look like? The Soviet Union had some of the best scientists in the world in the 50s and 60s. The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, was a Soviet cosmonaut. And a CIA report from 1969 indicated that during the 50s, especially in military technology, the USSR was close to achieving parity with Western Europe. So it is clear that they have invested considerably in education. How did they manage to exert control over their population? One of the mechanisms they used was to limit the free movement of people. by setting up both internal, but only selectively enforced, and external travel restrictions, it meant that the educated, perhaps more democratically inclined people had far less opportunity to leave the country. If we go along with the hypothesis that this video is examining, this should mean that the former Soviet republics were the perfect breeding ground for democracy, right? If we look back at the trajectory of the Soviet and Warsaw Pact states, the change has been very democratic for some states, have had mixed results for others, and in a few cases has actually become less democratic than they once were. To take a look at this, let's see how democracy has evolved in Kazakhstan, Estonia, and Azerbaijan. During the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan was part of the USSR. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan declared its independence in 1991. Nursultan Nazarbayev, a former Communist Party leader, became the country's first president. Initially, Kazakhstan took steps towards democratization, including adopting a new constitution in 1993 that provided for a multi-party system and the separation of powers. However, Nazarbayev's rule remained dominant, and opposition parties faced obstacles in gaining significant political influence. The 2000s are marked by democratic backsliding. Nazarbayev continued to consolidate power. Opposition parties were marginalized, and elections were criticized for lacking genuine competition and transparency. The government maintained tight control over the media, limiting freedom of speech and expression. In the early 2010s, Kazakhstan faced growing pressure to implement democratic reforms. Nazarbayev initiated a series of political modernization programs aimed at liberalizing the political system. However, critics argued that these reforms were largely cosmetic and did not address fundamental issues such as human rights abuses and corruption. Nazarbayev resigned as president in March 2019, and after nearly 3 decades in power, his handpicked successor, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, pledged to continue the modernization agenda while also addressing public demands for greater political openness. However, challenges to democracy persist, including restrictions on freedom of speech, limited political competition, and allegation of electoral fraud. One particular incident in January of 2022 involved the biggest riot since independence, where Tokayev called on troops from Moscow to help quell the uprisings. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Estonia regained its independence. The country swiftly transitioned towards democracy, reaffirming its commitment to democratic principles and the rule of law. Estonia adopted a new constitution, which established a parliamentary democracy with a president as head of state and a prime minister as head of government. In the years following independence, Estonia focused on building democratic institutions and fostering economic development. The country pursued integration with Western institutions, becoming a member of the European Union and NATO in 2004. These memberships reinforced Estonia's commitment to democratic values, human rights, and the rule of law. Estonia gained international recognition for its innovative approach to e-governance and digital democracy. The country implemented various online platforms and e-services to enhance citizen engagement, streamline government processes, and promote transparency. These efforts have contributed to Estonia's reputation as one of the most digitally advanced democracies in the world. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan declared its independence in 1991. Heydar Aliyev, a former communist leader, emerged as the dominant political figure and was elected as the country's president. In the early years of independence, Azerbaijan made some efforts towards democratization, including the adoption of a new constitution in 1995. However, Aliyev's rule was characterized by authoritarian tendencies, and opposition parties faced harassment and intimidation. After Heydar Aliyev's death in 2003, his son Ilyam Aliyev succeeded him as president. Under Ilyam Aliyev's leadership, Azerbaijan has experienced a further erosion of democratic freedoms and human rights. Opposition parties and independent media have faced increasing repression, and elections have been criticized for irregularities and lack of transparency. The ruling party, the New Azerbaijan Party, has maintained a firm grip on power, and political opposition has been largely marginalized. Azerbaijan's democratic shortcomings have been the subject of international criticisms, with organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International highlighting issues such as the political repression, censorship, and corruption. Despite pressures for reform, the Azerbaijani government has resisted significant changes to the political system, maintaining tight control over the country's institution. In economics, we often use indicators to give succinct overviews of development goals. Abstract concepts like the degree of democratization are impossible to measure concretely. So instead, we take a smaller, measurable indicators and tie them together to create a composite index. Here we will look at the democracy index and some of the most important measures which flow into it. The democracy index, which is published every year by Our World in Data, shows the broad degree of how democratic a country is. The democratization journey has been quite different for all three countries. Whereas Estonia quickly adopted democratic institutions and worked on improving access to elections, the same cannot be said about Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan maintained largely the same political system it inherited after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and so has been mainly stagnant in terms of democratizing. Azerbaijan fared slightly worse than Kazakhstan, starting its post-Soviet era positively, but quickly reneging on the promises to democratize. Today, the clearest differentiating factor between the two seems to be the lineage of the hand-picked successor. There seems to be a more politically accessible structure, accessible in quotation marks here, in Kazakhstan, where members outside the immediate circle of the current leader still have the opportunity to be selected for elected positions. In Azerbaijan, on the other hand, the only leadership selection process so far has been dynastic. Now that we have a quick overview of the history of democracy in these countries, we can start to find influencing economic factors. GDP per capita, a measure of how much overall production an economy puts out distributed over the total population, is a great measure to see how productive the average worker is. As we can see here, there's an important gap. Between 2000 and 2010, all three countries managed to roughly double their GDP per capita. The greatest difference can be seen with what happened after that point. The 2008 financial crisis impacted every country in the world. But while Estonia was more and more focused on switching to a service-based economy, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan maintained their largely extractive and production-based economies. You can see the real dip in GDP, as oil and gas prices fell in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Estonia, with a more robust economy and less extractive institutions, managed to reinvest the wealth they were creating in order to further boost their economy. By 2015, the trend of recovery from the financial crisis had continued in Estonia, while dropping off in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Looking next at inequality. The Gini coefficient is a measure of the inequality level of a country. A result closer to 1 indicates a more unequal distribution of wealth. The data provided by the World Bank is incomplete here for Azerbaijan, but it is the first time we see a divergence from the previous trend. Up until now, we have seen that typically democratic countries have better scores or results than less democratic countries. However, the Gini coefficient is one of the measures where we see a disparity in this, albeit the disparity is more often associated with a level of economic development rather than the government type. It tends to be that once countries achieve a certain level of development, their Gini coefficient slowly increases as extremely wealthy people begin to amass a very large fortune, whose potential pace for growth far outstrips other methods of wealth accumulation, such as working a high-paying career. For instance, Jeff Bezos can invest his fortune into a normal S&P 500 ETF, and even just at market returns will earn billions, meaning that the accumulation of wealth becomes easier the larger the overall pool of wealth in the economy is. Educational attainment, shown here by the mean years of schooling, is also a proxy indicator for democratization. Here we are starting to see the emergence of a generalized pattern. Economies which invest heavily into their human capital tend to be more democratized. There's an interesting chicken and the egg style question we can ask ourselves here, which is that democracies are just more willing to invest in their populations as potential power becomes more evenly distributed amongst their population, creating a self-reinforcing cycle? Or is it that nations which invest in their populations see inevitable democratization as citizens start to use their education to better understand and participate in the intricacies of governance? Trade as a percentage of GDP is an excellent indicator of how liberal an economy is. Remember that formula for GDP, consumer spending plus investment plus government spending plus net exports? We're looking at that last bit here. As economies develop, they typically start from relatively simple extractive industries, focusing on how to export resources. Eventually, those economies will shift to secondary industries, which actually make things with those raw resources. Those raw resource-made things can then be sold on the international market for more than the sum of its parts, meaning that countries which import raw resources but then export more valuable finished products should see their net exports increase, and therefore take a greater percentage of GDP. In theory, as a country continues to advance, services, also called tertiary industries, take a larger and larger percentage of the share of GDP. Special cases, such as Singapore or Luxembourg, might have the majority of their economic output originating from services. Say a company wishes to employ a consultant to solve a problem. From the GDP perspective, this wouldn't be an import, regardless of the nationality of the consultant. Instead, this would be reported as an increase in the investment component. This means we should be expecting both poor and very wealthy countries to have very low trade as a percentage of GDP figures. The rule of law index is a measure of how corrupt a country is. The rule of law, as the name implies, is the idea that the commonly established constitutional rules of a country supersede any other mandate of rules, such as the rule of decree, like in monarchies, the rule of God in theocracies, or structures such as authoritarian legalism. Authoritarian legalism is the idea that laws certainly exist in authoritarian countries, but the laws are more often than not just tools used to suppress dissent and maintain control over a population. The judiciary and legal institutions may lack independence and impartiality, leading to arbitrary enforcement of laws and violation of human rights. This index here shows a disparity between Estonia and our other two countries of choice. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia made it a priority to pass institutional and legal reforms, recognizing the importance of all levels of corruption. They introduced laws criminalizing bribery and created independent watchdogs agencies. In conjunction with better institutions, Estonia implemented transparency and accountability in governance. An e-governance system which improved democratic participation, focused on more public education and awareness, joined important international organizations, and arguably most importantly implemented whistleblower protection systems in order to protect the people who expose corruption. The result is that tons of foreign direct investment flowed into the country as foreign corporations were provided with safe investment opportunities. While FDI flows into Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan as well, the resulting industries were mostly primary extractive, mining and petrochemical industries. So we have seen a couple indicators. Although they show us important figures, it says nothing about how related they are with democratization. Here we can calculate the Pearson correlation coefficient with this handy-dandy formula, essentially a measure of how related two indicators are. Here I think it makes sense to compare every indicator with a democratization index. In this case, a positive number indicates a positive correlation, and a negative one, a negative correlation. What we have here is a fascinating pattern. If you notice, for some, but not all categories, the correlation between a democracy and a non- or flawed democracy seem to be inverted. Let's have a quick look as to why this might be the case for some categories, but not for others. Trade to GDP. It's unsurprising that we see a positive correlation in all three countries. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan are home to two important hydrocarbon industries, and so are very export-driven. Estonia is a little bit different, seeing as electricity and broadcasting equipment make up the biggest export categories. So while the two authoritarian countries are exporting relative low-value products, where little added labor has transformed the product, Estonia is importing raw resources and exporting finished products, meaning a lot of added value through labor. The Gini coefficient. Here the correlation coefficient leads to a seemingly confusing result. A negative result for Estonia and a positive one for Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. At first glance, this seems to show that as authoritarian countries become more democratic, their income inequality gets better, right? Well, that's wrong, because the Gini coefficient shows absolute inequality at a score of 1 and a perfect equality at a score of 0. So a negative correlation, such as in Estonia, indicates that as a country becomes more democratic, it becomes more equal with time. The mean years of schooling. Here again, we see a result which I believe is not really indicative of anything. A strong negative correlation would indicate that as a country becomes more educated, it becomes less democratic. Which, if we take a look at the list of the top 20 countries by mean years of schooling, the only non-democratic country on the list is Rwanda. Although that fact alone is not an end-all be-all, it shows a wide trend that my small analysis is not adhering to, and so I will cautiously discard this information. The rule of law index. This was a surprising result for me. However, just like in previous cases, the correlation makes sense. Looking at the rule of law index, we see that it mirrors the democratic index, and therefore a positive correlation is actually expected. So we've looked at some factors which may influence democratic movements, and we've seen how strongly these factors correlate with one another. But what does this tell us about our ideas of open borders and slowing down democratic transition? After all, politically persecuted people in authoritarian countries have a pretty good incentive to flee, and then work from safe countries to influence their home country's political systems. In the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, many Russian liberals fled the country, both to avoid conscription, but certainly also to flee political persecution. There's already a number of Russian-language media channels based in countries which have much freer media rules. This is near impossible to measure the impact that these organizations have, because there is no free access to large-scale information in authoritarian countries. But undoubtedly, this information would not have the reach it does if these people would not have the chance to leave the country in the first place. In addition, these people and organizations clearly represent a threat to authoritarians, as these authoritarians spend resources and time trying to track and silence these figures. Look no further than the series of assassinations undertaken by Russia, the diverted Ryanair flight by Belarus, the recent assassination of Sikh activists in Canada by India, or the brutal dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, a prominent critic of Saudi Arabia. It's a strange conundrum. One can reasonably assume that if the Soviet Union had let its citizens freely leave, there may not have been the same revolutionary pressure building up contributing to the downfall of the Soviet Union. But simultaneously, had there not been Soviet citizens living outside the Soviet Union, that revolutionary spirit may not have been built up in the first place. Finally, we can take a look at a nation which has a super restrictive emigration policy, that is with an E, so people trying to leave the country. North Korea. There are roughly 31,000 North Korean defectors living in South Korea, with a further 10,000 living in China. Given the incredible risk and physical challenge of defecting, it is safe to say that the people who do defect are incredibly motivated to do so. In an article published by NK News, an English-language Seoul-based news agency reporting on North Korea, only a small percentage of those fleeing North Korea did so due to the search of freedom or dislike of government. Even if you take a leap and assume that all of these people wanted to live in a democracy, this is still an astoundingly low number. More importantly, this speaks directly against the hypothesis presented in this video. Ultimately, the only way of knowing if having open borders truly harms democratic movements in authoritarian countries would be to interview a statistically significant number of migrants or refugees from these countries. As you can imagine, this is unfortunately outside the scope of a hobby YouTube project. I am just one guy with no funding and an interest for strange economics topics. However, I hope this video has inspired someone in a position to undertake said research to maybe have a go at it. Perhaps with the greater resources, they could bring some more verifiable answers to the table. This would allow us in democratic nations to make informed decisions and might help fellow believers in democracy to spread that ideology to their own countries. Finally, I want to leave you with a quick timeline in the state of democracy since 1945. We can see that huge progress has been made. Many populous countries like India, Turkey, Indonesia, and pretty much the whole of South America used to be democratic. Even Venezuela used to have a thriving democracy, something unimaginable today. As we further progress towards the present, we can see that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia and many former Soviet socialist republics became more democratic. But starting in the early 2010s, we can see a broader trend developing. New democracies and even certain established democracies have begun backsliding. India, Turkey, but even Western democracies, Hungary and Poland are notable. But if we look back at the last 10 years, no country in the world has gotten more democratic. In the West, we often have a naive view of political development. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been an almost arrogant presumption that democracy is inevitable and a natural state of human beings. Democracy is an ongoing process, which never has an end goal. One unexpected benefit of the Trump presidency has been a sort of waking up to this idea. Our democracies are fragile, like an F1 car. Many different complex parts move together with grace, and with active maintenance, we can bring about incredible positive change to millions of people's lives. But if we allow bad actors to go unchecked, our engines may clog up, and we will crash and burn in a fire of authoritarianism. Ultimately, we the people are the mechanics.